Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Felice Snade, and I'm so glad to welcome you to Communication Across Generations, the challenges of talking with one another during the COVID-19 pandemic with Dr. Mark Agronin, Senior Vice President for Behavioral Health at the Miami Jewish Health Institute, presented on behalf of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County and Mind Institute at Miami Jewish Health. A special welcome to the new faces joining us today, and a pleasure to see the many familiar faces and names. Our Federation Live virtual programs are among the many ways we have been reaching out to bring our Jewish community together over the past 4.5 months. At the same time, our Federation is also working to meet the rising critical needs of our people here in Israel and beyond. Through our annual campaign, our Federation's funding for more than 70 partner agencies enables us to respond immediately in times like these. With our Federation's vital support, our agencies on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis are able to continue, adapt, and increase their care for those most vulnerable in face of these unprecedented challenges. Our Federation is approaching the close of our 2020 annual campaign, and we are still trying to raise the critical dollars necessary to meet the needs of our community. We need to make sure our seniors are safe and continue to live with dignity. We need to give those with special needs the opportunity to live a life full of joy and hope. Even during these times, we need to ensure that our partners around the world in more than 70 countries can respond to crises like the COVID-19 pandemic that is affecting so many. We need to say to our brothers and sisters in Israel, we've not forgotten you. You are in our hearts, in our minds, and we will continue to give you our support. We need to have to make some difficult decisions if we do not raise the funds to keep our community strong. If you're in a position to help, we ask that you go online today to make a gift to our annual campaign. Every donation of any size makes a difference, and there are so many people counting on us. If everyone on the call would make a donation of $36, think of how many people would benefit. After our program, we'll email you some information to learn more about us and how to help, along with additional virtual opportunities to connect. Before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. We've been made aware that Zoom has been having some technical difficulties all over the country. If for any reason you get logged out of the program, you can log back in using the same link that was provided to you. In the event that Dr. Agronin is logged out, please sit tight and be patient. We'll be back online as soon as possible. For the best sound quality, your microphone is muted for the presentation. In addition, you can adjust the way your screen appears. If you would like to view the person who is speaking, please select Speaker View at the top of the Zoom screen. And if time allows, we will have a Q&A at the conclusion of the presentation. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our speaker. Dr. Mark Agronin, a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard University and the Yale School of Medicine, is a board-certified adult and geriatric psychiatrist and the author of the acclaimed book, How We Age. Since 1999, he has served as the Director of Mental Health Services, Clinical Research, and the Outpatient Memory Center at Miami Jewish Health. He has published essays in the New York Times and Scientific American Mind and writes regularly on aging and retirement issues for the Wall Street Journal as part of their experts panel. We are delighted and thrilled to have Mark Agronin joining us again. Thank you, Mark. You can start.
Elise, thank you so much for the introduction, and I just want to echo everything you said about the Federation in South Palm Beach County. You do such important work, and I'm so happy that everyone on today is able to hear about that and support you, so that's very important. So welcome to the presentation today. It's interesting that I actually wrote, the talk is based on something I wrote at the very beginning of this pandemic. And so much has changed since then. Now, if you can believe it, only 4 or 5 months down the line. So it'll be interesting as I go through this to comment on some of the changes in how we communicate. But it really stemmed from some experiences I had at the very beginning of this pandemic, communicating with my parents and other individuals, and really thinking about how as generations, we talk to one another. And so I'd like to share some thoughts with you from this article. And if you're interested afterwards, the copy of the article could be made available to anyone. So before jumping in, I wanted to talk a little bit about where I work. So Miami Jewish Health has been serving the South Florida community since 1946. Our focus initially, all the way back at our beginning, was serving as a small nursing home for Jewish residents. But in the over 60 years that we've been here, we've grown into not only a large 20-acre campus right in the heart of Miami, but we have programs all throughout the community in both Broward and Dade counties. Our focus is on caring primarily for older individuals across the entire spectrum of care. So we have a nursing home, but we also have independent living, assisted living, a small hospital unit, a hospice unit. My own role for the past 21 years has been working on overseeing the behavioral health at Miami Jewish Health, and also focusing on working with individuals who have Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, what we call neurocognitive disorders. To that end, I oversee something called Mind Institute at Miami Jewish Health. Mind Institute, on the face of it, is a memory disorder center. So individuals who are worried about changes in memory to all the way to individuals who have a formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or a related form of dementia or neurocognitive disorder can come to our programs for evaluation and second opinions, for management over time, if they have associated depression or anxiety. Pretty much everything that someone might need is what we work with. Mind Institute at Miami Jewish Health actually now is one of the official memory disorder centers, or MDCs, in Florida. There's currently 17. And so we play an active role in the community, also in terms of education. I just want to say one thing, because to give you a sense for our philosophy, and I think you'll see how this plays in the talk today. We tend to think about something like Alzheimer's disease in terms of a disease that people get, that progresses over time, and that really diminishes people. I want us to really think in a very different way, especially today, since we're talking about the importance of communication and understanding people, regardless of age, regardless of the generation. All of us live with changes as we get older. For some people, these changes affect their memory and other skills more than others. Our approach is to understand not only the changes, but what are someone's strengths? What are they able to do? What do they love to do? Who are they as individuals, as persons? And we build a relationship with them. And so our approach is very unique. The way they interact with me as their doctor and with my entire staff here is unique. And so we're really focused on brain fitness. We're focused on the latest in clinical research. And increasingly, we're focused on prevention, preventing us from getting some of these disorders in the first place, or if we do have changes, preventing things from getting worse or from getting us into situations that can be really difficult. So if you're interested in anything we do now with telehealth, we can see anyone throughout the state. Please reach out to the sponsors, and we'll be happy to send you more information about what we do. So, and this program today is also jointly sponsored by Mind Institute at Miami Jewish Health. So, with that, let's begin with the program. This slide states the obvious. We are all feeling stress during this pandemic. It's a serious situation, and we need to talk about it, because that stress, maybe at the very beginning, meant we're going to be at home for maybe a few weeks, maybe a month. Now we're 5+ months into this, and we see that this is having a pervasive effect on our lives. On top of that, we are in the middle of the storm right now. You just look at any news and you see that Florida right now not only has a surge, but we are one of the highest areas in the entire planet now in terms of facing this. And so what it means is that not only do we need to be super cautious, but it also means we're still isolated at home, or at least that's what we need to be doing. And so all of these issues of how we deal with this isolation, with separation from people, with not being able to engage in all the important things in our lives, causes an enormous amount of stress. We need to talk about that. We need to think about it and face it. And where it begins is how to communicate with one another, especially how to communicate across different generations. Now, at the very beginning of the pandemic, which seems like years ago, I was getting a lot of phone calls. And the phone calls were mainly from adult children of individuals that I work with in the clinic. And they were panicked over their parents, for a few of them their grandparents, because they didn't feel they were really getting what's going on here. They felt that they had somewhat of a cavalier attitude towards this, and they were worried what was going to happen with them during this pandemic. They were seeing what was happening in New York at the time, in New Jersey. I work here in a nursing home, and so you can imagine, even if they know their loved ones aren't going out, they're worried about the effects of just being locked in their rooms or locked in the building for their safety. But how do you talk to someone about that? How do you communicate about that? And what I really saw were some of these disconnections between generations. So an adult child of someone may be saying one thing, but the person they're talking to is hearing something else. At the time, I do some regular blogging for the Wall Street Journal, and they'd reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to take some of my thoughts and put it into an article. And so the article came out. It was entitled, "Why It's So Hard to Talk to Your Parents About the Coronavirus and Vice Versa." But it really was a larger piece on just this issue of how we talk to one another, especially when we're in a very different station of life. And so I want to focus on that in the talk and leave you with some very, very specific suggestions on how we can move beyond this. So it's really difficult, and I think it's risky to generalize about any generation. So I want to state at the outset that I think I tried to capture what some of the different generations were saying to one another, but it's not the end all be all, and perhaps in the discussion afterwards, you may have some thoughts about that and some feedback on that. What's common to all of us? Everyone is scared about losing something, but each generation is different because you're at a different stage in life. What happens is that when we get so fearful, when we get under so much stress, we tend to speak to other people and not with other people. And this is where a lot of communication begins to break down. And generations often speak different languages. And I literally thought about this in terms of as if someone speaking Spanish is speaking to someone who's a French speaker, and they can't really, they hear the words, but they don't know how to understand it. And so I put this into 3 different categories, and I'll define each one. I call it 40-ish, 60-ish, and 80-ish. Those are these languages we're going to talk about today. And what I'm asserting is that the words may be the same, but the meanings are very different. And this can only increase the stress, because when we're trying to get support for others or try to help or protect others, when we don't feel they're listening or understanding, and vice versa, it really amplifies the stress. It amplifies these fears that we have. So let's start with the group I call speakers of 40-ish. These are basically individuals from age 30 to 50, or into their mid-50s. And I would say what was clear very early in the pandemic, and it's generally continued through then, is that in this age group, people generally perceive themselves as safe. They think that, well, even if they get it, they look at the statistics and feel that it may be something unpleasant, uncomfortable, but they don't always have the same worries, at least about their own lives, as other individuals may. However, they really are concerned about loved ones who are older, because they see them as very vulnerable, and they hear in the media or they see what's going on that these individuals are almost considered expendable. We don't hear that language so much, but think back to the early part of the pandemic when there's this discussions about if you run out of ventilators, how do you decide who gets one? And at the end of the day, certain people, in essence, are seen as somewhat expendable. If you look at the number, a profile of people who have died from the COVID-19 pandemic, almost a third of them are nursing home residents. And so it just tells you that there's reason for people to be really nervous about older loved ones. What I also saw is the following, that a lot of these younger individuals whose role was often transient or somewhat limited with older individuals now changed, and they really stepped into the role as a protector. And I think what this caused, this led to a lot of these very frantic concerns about individuals who suddenly felt that their parents or their grandparents' lives were in their hands. And so anything that they interpreted as not adhering to the rules that they imposed was really seen as somewhat crazy. And so I give the example here. Someone 40-ish may say, you left the house and went where today? And what they're really saying is, I'm worried about your safety, but it's not always heard that way. And for many of these individuals, such messages may have been unspoken before because they never really had to be such a fierce protector. They never before had to worry about necessarily if a parent or grandparent leaves the house that they could be putting their life in danger. They didn't have to worry about the fact that if, God forbid, a parent or a grandparent had to go to the hospital, that they might never see them again. And this brought even more fear and more stress and more panic. And I think what that led to is so many of the messages getting very, very strong, sometimes a little too strong. And it may be because these were unspoken messages before, or they're new messages that they weren't always understood as a way of saying, I'm worried about your safety, but they were heard as something somewhat harsh and even resented by older individuals. So now we come to a very different generation. These are individuals, I call them speakers of 60-ish, who are in their late 50s to 70s. In general, this generation, these are really the adult children of most of the patients I work with. They pride themselves on their energy, on their independence, on caring for themselves, and many of them are still, and many of you on the call are maybe in this situation, caring for both kids and parents at the same time. In the past, this was old age. If you turn back the clock to the early part of the 20th century, if you were in your 50s, that was old age. Hence, Medicare kicks in at in your early 60s or 65, because at that point, you didn't have many years left on average. That's completely different today. I don't think anyone considers speakers of 60-ish to be old in any way, or at least if we use the word old in a pejorative way, which we need to avoid. But what happened with so many of these individuals is that suddenly they're cut off from family and friends, and this challenges a lot of both the purpose that they have at this time, being caregivers for other people, both pre and post-retirement plans as well, have been completely disrupted. And so I think this is a group that has very youthful mindsets, but suddenly they realize, if you look at the statistics, when they talk about a vulnerable group, an older vulnerable group, they're talking about them as well. And so I think for many individuals, this really shattered that sense of maybe not invulnerability, I wouldn't say that, but the sense of independence and these purposeful planned activities that they had in some ways are really shook up or really shattered. And so hearing from a younger generation saying, you left the house and went where today? The message really is that, you are much older and vulnerable to illness and death than you think. And to be in your 60s and 70s and not really want to think about the fact that your life could come to an abrupt end, suddenly to be faced with an illness that can challenge that and that you hear about. So I think for many individuals who speak 60-ish, this really precipitated somewhat of a crisis. So now we come to a very different generation, what I call the speakers of 80-ish. These are individuals primarily in their late 70s to 90s. So, and to me, the message had changed a lot, because I think when we first began this pandemic, this idea of social distancing is a real threat, and it's changed in so many pernicious ways since then. If you're at a stage in your life when you don't have as much time left as you had when you were younger, doing something meaningful to you is so important. This is your life. This is the time you have to do that. Suddenly you have to social distance. Suddenly you can't leave the house. What does that mean? This is not primarily a generation, as I say, of Netflix and texting and video chats. It doesn't come so quickly and so naturally, although now 4 or 5 months into it, I think anyone in this generation has become a near expert on that. But early on, their daily routines, their time spent with other people, with other groups, with activity, these are the key sustainers of life. And when you take this away for someone who also is looking at the horizon much closer, it becomes a real threat to their identity, to what they want for their life. So when someone 80-ish says, I want to see my friends and play cards with, just an example, I think people are really saying, look, there's not that much time left to enjoy myself. Younger people hear them saying they're kind of oblivious to the risks. I don't think that's the case. And so what I saw often is these conversations between adult children and their parents, and the adult children kind of accusing their parents or older individuals of really ignoring what was going on or being oblivious to it. And I don't think that was the case. I think for so many of these individuals, what they're saying is that, look, there's lots of threats, COVID-19 being just one of them to my life. I can't let that interrupt my life. Today it could be an infectious pandemic. Tomorrow it could be a stroke, or God forbid, something else. Again, what we're seeing is that whether these are literal conversations or not, the generations have different perspectives that result in different ways of communicating. But this is what I want to emphasize, that, and I'm going to focus on speakers of 80ish, because the perspective that they have here really comes from a wiser, and what I'm going to describe, a less reactive mindset that in some ways is already used to being socially isolated. If you're in your 30s and 40s and 50s, being alone or being socially isolated is different. It's a challenge. It's not normally part of your life. For many individuals in their 80s and 90s, this is part of their life already. And so for some individuals, it hasn't turned out to be such a radical change. Really interesting surveys that were done. Again, these are early on in the pandemic, but I think these probably would hold true to a large extent now. So one survey was done by a group called YouGov, and what they wanted to do is look at individuals in 3 different age groups: age 18 to 34, between the age of 35 and 54, and then 55 and older. And they wanted to know, how do you feel more or less lonely, or no difference as a result of these coronavirus lockdowns. And it was interesting because the older individuals, 80% of them felt no change at all, compared to younger groups who, a third of younger people felt more lonely, a fifth of individuals 35 to 54. But look, older individuals reported on the whole feeling either less lonely or no change at all. Let's pair this with another survey, in which this is one done by the Pew Research Group, and these are done for thousands of people that they surveyed, asking them what's your level of distress that you're feeling. And again, the older group, 61% of them reported relatively low levels of distress, compared to younger individuals, where only a third of them felt a low level of distress. Now, I suspect that these have changed over time, but I want to talk about this phenomenon. Why is it that this older group that people see as more vulnerable, more subject to interruption from this, why are they doing so much better in that respect? So let's talk a little bit about what aging does to our bodies and brains and our mindsets that is different from what we typically think about. I want to start by using the key word here, resilience. Resilience is the way we adapt to adversity. It's a way of absorbing, accommodating some sort of change, some sort of stress or blow, and then resuming basically normal functioning. What we know is that if you look at us physically, we become less resilient with age. The older body, with any stress, especially physical stress, is more vulnerable. We see this with COVID-19. Older individuals who survive the initial infection, often the bodies are really worn out, and we see a lot of persistent issues, both not only in terms of pulmonary function, but also in terms of neurologic function that persists long afterwards. Physically, we're not as resilient, no question. Psychologically, older individuals become more resilient in many cases. If you look at any studies of natural disasters, I'll take Hurricane Katrina as an example. What they found is that even though older individuals had disproportionately high rates of death from physical issues, if you studied rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in individuals afterwards, older individuals did much better, because they're able to draw upon their knowledge, their experience, their social connections, their willingness to get involved, to really make a difference. In fact, it's interesting that some studies looking at people getting ready and preparing for natural disasters, a hurricane coming or some other issue going on, find that older individuals play a really key role as volunteers, helping people reduce stress. They call this their social capital. It goes against what our stereotypes. We tend to see older individuals as falling apart, as completely more vulnerable, as not able to play a role and becoming dependent on us. And yet often it's the opposite. So for this reason, I knew early on that we can turn to, and we should turn to, older individuals in terms of their wisdom and their ability to help. And before we end, I'm going to tell you a really lovely story when I first began that really brought this home on a very personal level to me. Why is it that older individuals are more psychologically resilient? Where do these strengths come from? We tend to think the older brain is in decline, but keep in mind the following, that with time, our brains continue to develop. Everyone gets that letter in the mail when you turn 50, or now it's, I think, when you turn 45 from AARP saying, hey, why don't you join? You're now part of the older generation. You don't get a similar letter in the mail telling you that, guess what, now that you become 45 or 50, you stop growing, you stop learning, you stop acquiring experience. It's the opposite. Our brains, our minds continue to make connections amongst brain cells. We continue to gain intelligence, we learn skills, we gain experiences, we build up a reserve in our mind. It's like putting money in the bank. Our brain reserve refers to just the stuff in our brain, the connections. It's not about how many brain cells we have, it's about how well connected they are. That this continues to increase your entire life. We also build up what we call a cognitive reserve. This is all the skills and experience and knowledge we have, and this continues to build through our lifetime. The other thing that happens with the older brain is that we can adapt to stress. It's called neuroplasticity. Our brains are constantly adapting and resculpting themselves. And by doing this, we're able to deal with and cope with different changes. And it's fascinating when you look at an older brain how that happens. There's two fundamental processes that happen that most people are not even aware of, because they tend to focus on their brain as becoming less active and having lapses or deficits. But I want you to think about this in a very different way. Your brain is able, as you get older, to recruit more brain circuits for a given task. So if you picture a room of people, one side is the left part of your brain, the other is the right part of your brain, and you put a math problem on the board. The younger brain, you pick one person in the audience. That's like one small part of your brain, and that solves the problem. The older brain, the older audience is going to pick 5 or 6 people to do it. This is just what your brain does naturally, because all your intelligence, your skills, your experiences, which are spread throughout your brain, you bring to bear on these situations. And this is why someone facing adversity has so much more in terms of their abilities and cognitive abilities and perspectives to bring to situations. The other fascinating thing, and we know this because you can watch this on certain types of brain scans, your brain tends to use both sides more when you're older than when you're younger. We recruit more regions of our brain to think about things, to focus on things. And this is why we see this change as we get older in terms of our perspective. And if I asked you, when do you think you make better, more reasoned decisions, now or when you're 18 or 20? I think most of us say, well, obviously now. But why is that? It's because of what your brain can do, the power of your brain that comes from age. And so I emphasize this because when we think about communicating across the generations, we need to keep in mind what our skills and abilities are. And we develop new approaches, and I just want to focus on 3 of them. One is called postformal thinking, one is called socioemotional selectivity, the other is called developmental intelligence. What do I mean by this? So postformal thinking basically says that we think in more pragmatic and practical ways. When we deal with a situation, we're not as reactive, we're not as rigid, we're not as impulsive as we get older. Now, this is not the rule for everyone, but in general, if you look at research done on how older individuals approach problem solving, this really is the rule. And think about this in your own life. How do you deal with problems and situations now than when you were much younger? And again, what most people find is that they're just less reactive. They're less impulsive. These are important positive changes in your brain. The other thing that happens is a theory called socioemotional selectivity. And what that refers to is how older brains tend to perform more positive experience. We gravitate towards activities and goals that are more meaningful to us. And in part, I think we make this calculation that if the horizon is closer, I'm going to do something that's more meaningful and important to me at this stage. And contrary to what people think, we tend to think of older people in a stereotypical way as more depressed and more negative. It's actually the opposite. In fact, rates of major depressive disorder go down as we get older. They don't increase, in part because we tend to be more positive, more hopeful. I think this may be related in part to the fact that some of the brain centers, in particular something called the amygdala in the brain, which is our the center of our brain that senses danger, it's not as reactive. It's balanced by other parts of the brain, as we talked about before. Different parts of the brain are in better communication with one another, and so they can inhibit impulses and bring in other perspectives. And when you put all that together, it's what we call developmental intelligence. It's a combination, a synergy of our cognitive abilities, our emotions, our judgments, our social skills. It's more integrated, it's more balanced. Putting this all together, this is what we call wisdom. And so what I'm conveying to you is that as we get older, these changes happen naturally. It's not just a change in how we think, it's literally a change in how our brains function. It brings these strengths to us. And so when you're communicating with someone who's older, keep in mind that there's great power and great ability there that makes a difference. And so sometimes we think we're the protectors, and we need to keep in mind that maybe it's really the opposite in many situations. And I'll give you one really beautiful example of this, and this is based on a theory of how we adapt with age. The great piano player Arthur Rubinstein, who was one of the greatest players, certainly of his generation, probably in history, as he got older, without question, his memory, his cognitive abilities were slower, as everyone experiences as we get older. That's normal. His motor dexterity in his hands and his fingers was certainly not as quick, not as sharp. And yet somehow he was able to perform in ways that people thought was so genius, had such great depth, even more so than when he was younger. And they asked him, he said, how do you do it? And he described three things he does, which fits exactly this theory developed by a researcher by the name of Baltes, as one way to think about successful aging. He said, first of all, I'm more selective in when I perform. I'm not going to perform every part of my repertoire from when I'm younger. I'm going to focus on those things that I know I can do well. He said, secondly, I need to practice a lot. In fact, he said, I sometimes need to practice more than I did before to optimize his performance. And finally, what he said, and I think this is the real genius part of this, he said, I have to perform in a different way, sometimes to compensate. So for instance, if there's a part of a piece that normally you play very, very rapidly, and I know I can't play that with the same dexterity or speed, I may play it louder, or I may accentuate certain parts of it to really give it a different feel. And so it's a compensation, but it also is giving more of him, a greater depth to the performance. So let's take this away from playing a great piano concerto and think about things you do every day in your life. It may be using a computer in Zoom. It may be, suddenly having to do video chats, or, changing part of your life to doing it the way you're doing it today. You have to be more selective. You have to optimize and practice and try to find ways to make it work well. Maybe there's certain things you're going to do and certain things not on the computer, but it's the same process where you're adapting. And what I emphasize to people is you have the ability, you have the wisdom to not only adapt, but to bring your personhood into it, to make it unique for you. You're not going to use, and I'm just using an example of the computer, you're not going to use it the same way someone 20 or 25 or 30 may be. You're going to use it differently, but differently is not less. In fact, for you, it certainly is more meaningful and more relevant to who you are. So let's go back to communication. Let's apply this. When we talk to other generations, whether older or younger than us, and if we can't understand one another, it's really like the Tower of Babel. The words are coming out, but we don't know what the other person is saying, and it's a really feeling of being lost. It just increases the stress that we all feel. So how can we do better? And what I like to do is just give some three different, just really straightforward, basic ways that we can improve communication. Everyone's going to understand because you do this already. The first one is just ask questions. The second is be patient. The third is be empathic. So let me take each one and then we'll get into some discussion. You know, as I said at the beginning, our instinct is kind of to talk to others during this time. And if you add on the layer of what's going on in our society, everyone is talking to one another. We all have our truth, we have our beliefs, our philosophies, and we're really happy to put that out to other people. In fact, now with the internet, you can plunk it down and push a button and it's out there. The problem is that we're talking to one another and often only to the people we want to talk to. We're not really talking at times with other people. So the first step is very simple. Put aside your agenda. Put aside what you need to get across or what you think is right, what you think is the truth, and just ask questions, especially if you're worried about someone or concerned about someone. And this can be older or younger. If you're in your 80s or 90s and you want to communicate with someone in their 20s and 30s, instead of thinking I have nothing to say to them or they're so different, it's just about asking questions. You know, how are you feeling? How are you coping with this? What are you doing? Tell me about this. It's a time to just ask questions. And, you know, you learn this to be a really good therapist. You have to just sometimes ask a question and keep your mouth shut. And just listen and ask another question to clarify or ask what someone needs. Just that process begins to create this dialogue. It says to the person, you have value. You're important to me. I want to learn about you. And that begins to transform the way we interact. It gives us that space and that time to really begin to truly communicate. On that notion of time, we'll come back to that in a minute. So, for instance, let's talk about our different groups. I think for speakers of 40-ish, the questions are important because then they really can explain the practical and technological solutions that are needed. Let's take Zoom, for example. Zoom, whatever, it can be frustrating to use this. There's so much in the computer now. All of us, and I include myself in that category, had a very steep learning curve. And sometimes it's easy to just kind of dismiss it or not focus on it. But we really, those individuals who know it well, we want to give them the time to really explain and know that we're really listening. The other thing, I think for the 60th speakers who are full of a sense of independence normally, but are feeling more dependent now, or having fears of mortality that maybe they tried to push away, these need to be voiced. These need to be talked about. And that begins the dialogue for people themselves to understand that it's normal and natural, and that dependence can be really good and very healthy. And it doesn't mean that you're ceding your abilities, your life away. In terms of speakers of 80-ish, we need to hear their perspective. We need to ask them how they got through certain things, because younger people may be panicked over maybe less a threat of the pandemic to their lives and more to their health, their careers, their retirement plans. Talk to someone who's been through that. If you've been through the Depression, the Second World War, the Cold War, all these different things, you have a lifetime of experience that people need to hear. They need to understand. It's so important. And we have time. That's the most abundant currency of this pandemic, is time to sit with one another, to talk with one another. We have to tell each other, breathe slowly, be more patient. It helps relax our nervous systems and reduce stress, but it also gives us the ability to really listen to other people and to feel confident in speaking to one another. You know, it's so tempting to, when we talk to people, that we hear just enough that we're able to launch into our own opinions, our own truths. But the problem is we cut people off so quickly sometimes, and we're not really listening. We think we maybe look like we are, but we're not really doing so. Each generation has its own power and truth, and we need to give time for that to emerge, and not just emerge, but really emerge with clarity. And looking at the power of patience for different groups, I think for speakers of 40-ish, they need to be patient to understand that someone in the 80s and 90s really can learn how to use Zoom and all this other technology. I'm picking on Zoom today, but I think you know what I mean. And they can slow down and take the time to really explain it, because I see this happening all the time. And I'm sure everyone on the call has been in this situation. You're frantic over trying to use a computer for something. You talk to someone younger, and they're throwing stuff at you very quickly, and it's frustrating, and you're talking to one another. You've got more than enough time to really learn and teach. And I would say this, for speakers of 60-ish, you know, you can take your voice and your skills and find really effective ways to give and receive, and not just give, but receive support, even though you're at home at times, and help younger people make that transition, help them understand that maybe there are some secrets to life before we were all wired that are really powerful and really important. It helps slow us down and reduce our stress and find more meaning in what we do. And for speakers of 80-ish, they have these powerful coping skills, but they need often help getting their voices out. If we only look at them as actual or potential victims that we need to pity or protect, we're not really having a mutual conversation with them. We're diminishing them before we even begin speaking. Giving them the time, being patient to really listen, to ask questions and find out where they've been and how things are going makes all the difference. And suddenly these words that didn't seem to make sense begin to emerge with meaning and with clarity. And then finally, be empathic. If you're asking questions, you're taking time to listen to other people, it's going to transport you into the shoes of other people. It's going to activate, we have this inborn empathic ability to literally experience, or at least imagine, what another generation may be going through, to understand their mindset, to understand their language. For speakers of 40-ish, this worry, this exasperation they may have for someone older who's not doing what they want them to do, I think this can really be changed into a sense of respect and awe for the experience of the other person, for the wisdom that they have, and really want to understand that and want to engage with them. For speakers of 60-ish, this empathy can help them understand not only the needs of other people, but also the capability of individuals who are older and younger. I think when you're in a generation where you see yourself as the caregiver for younger and older, it's easy to see yourself as the agent of change and support and care, but it has to be mutual. And you have to really feel a sense of purpose and support, but for yourself as well. And then for speakers of 80-ish, it can help them translate these frantic words and experiences and concerns of younger people into this message that it's a very powerful and reassuring expression of love and protection. Here it is, maybe they felt lonely or isolated, and they have someone much younger frantically trying to protect them. See it as that, and understand how much they care for you, how much they want to help. And I've seen so many poignant, tragic, and also beautiful connections between young and older generations. And the one thing this pandemic, with all the disease and destruction it's also brought us such a crystal clear understanding of what's important to us, what's meaningful for us, and how these older individuals, too many of them were being affected by this and dying from this, that we need to cherish them. We need to do everything possible to save them and protect them during this time. And just as a final word, with time, with patience, with this mutual interest, what happens is our words to one another begin to make sense. They really begin to make sense and take on meaning. We just have to listen to one another. At the end, that's really what it's all about. So we're coming to, I think we have about 15 minutes left. Again, if you're interested in what we do at Mind Institute for yourself, someone you know, someone you love who is concerned about their memory, concerned about any psychiatric needs, especially now telehealth, instead of schlepping all the way down to Miami, I can travel to you. And so, the sponsors can give you information on how to reach out to us. But we are open here and running and happy to help out in any way. The article on which the talk was based on today from the Wall Street Journal came out on April 20th, if you happen to get a subscription to it, but also I'm making it available as a PDF that the sponsors can send out to you. And finally, if you want to learn more about this notion of aging bringing strength, I'd refer you to, I have two books, the first one called How We Age, the sequel called The End of Old Age. And the message is that we need to change the way we think about aging. We need to see the depth, the richness, the beauty of the aging process, and that contrary to how we stereotypically look at aging, that aging actually brings great strengths, and I've talked about some of them today. And finally, if you are a caregiver, someone is, I have a book called The Dementia Caregiver, which is really an A to Z guide to helping people who have Alzheimer's disease or any other form of dementia. And again, Mind Institute at Miami Jewish Health, and in general, Miami Jewish Health is happy to be available in any way, shape, or form for anything you may need. So with that, again, I want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the call today. It really is just my pleasure and honor. Thank you so much to the staff at the Federation of South Palm Beach County. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm always happy to do this. And I'd love to take any questions or comments that anyone here may have.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Agronin. We'll do a wrap up in a minute, but does anyone have any questions for Dr. Agronin right now? If you do, you can, where it says participants, if you hover, it'll say raise hand, and you can raise a hand and we will call on you.
I think there's a question from Ida. Ida, I'm going to unmute you.
Thanks, Jules. Thank you, Mark, Dr. Agronin. I have a question, not specific so much to COVID per se, but have you found in your research a relationship between, because I've seen it in sort of my own personal experience with dealing with elderly parents, that there's a correlation between sort of pain management, like the ability, like when you're dealing with chronic pain in older age, is there a relationship between that and that sort of resiliency? Almost like the well of coping and skill is drained by dealing with chronic pain. Because I've seen in my own experience dealing with elderly in-laws that once very resilient individuals, as they've aged and are dealing on such day-to-day issues of real physical pain, that sometimes actually the reverse of what you were saying is that what was once a very small issue could be coped with. Actually, the reverse is there's just no resources left to handle it. I was wondering if you've experienced that in your research.
Sure, and we've had a major pain center here on grounds of Miami Jewish Health for many years, and so we work hand in hand with them, with people with chronic pain. So I would look at it in two different ways. Acute pain from whatever cause is absolutely debilitating and exhausting for people. And it's hard to plan, it's hard to feel good about yourself, it's hard to move forward when all you feel is pain all day. And so that's why it's so important in those situations to really aggressively treat the pain. And especially realize that pain is not just in the hand or the back or the foot where you have it, pain is also in the brain. Because at the end of the day, it's our brain that senses, processes, and deals with pain. And so we need to take a holistic approach. It's about physically working with the body. It's also about working with the mind. And I say this because people who have chronic pain over time, the pain begins to take on a life of its own. It takes on a certain meaning to them. For some people, it almost becomes a way of life because they don't see anything different than that. And it can be really difficult because then they can get depressed and get anxious. And you have to be able to get them involved in good habits to deal with the pain, to make it not take over their life and have such great meaning for them. I'll give you an example. I always think about this. Many years ago, I worked with an older woman who had chronic pain and just didn't feel she could get out of it. And when we were talking about history, she told me that she'd been a nurse during Vietnam War, and she worked at a hospital in Japan. And she remembers that these soldiers would come in and they had horrible injuries and wounds and clearly had reason to be in terrible pain, and yet she was shocked at often how little pain they had, or at least they didn't complain about it. And what she came to understand is that for them, their wound, their injury, whatever, meant that they were going home. They had survived in what other form. And she saw that our expectations, our perceptions shaped pain. This is an important lesson. This is a part of the reason why at the pain center that we've had at Miami Jewish Health, it's not just about physical therapy, it's about behavioral therapy, it's about psychiatric or psychological therapy. It's all part of that together, because your question had to do with, does it sap someone's resilience? It does, but for some people, it becomes their reason for being. It becomes what they're focused on, and they get so wrapped up into it that taking away the pain is almost like taking away what's meaningful to them because they don't have other things. So it's really important, if you're working with someone with chronic pain, to think about what else is important and meaningful in their life, that they need to engage in, that they need to be brought to that, because that's going to help sustain them. And this is a rule for everything we do. Someone with Alzheimer's disease, that we look at them as getting more impaired in their memory. What is meaningful to them? What brings them purpose that we can continue to get them involved in, and not just focus on what's not there, what the deficits are. So it's a lesson for all of us in terms of the best approaches here. And it's the greatest challenge too, because it's easy to focus on they're in pain, go to see the doctor, take the pill, when it's really a much bigger formula than that. This is where this communication comes in, because the better you can understand someone older, a different generation, the more empathy you can have, the better you can understand how can we deal with this pain. So thank you, good question.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you, Mark. Any other questions? Jules, do you see any other questions?
No, I don't see anything else.
Okay, well, Mark, I want to reiterate our thanks and appreciation to you for taking the time to be with us today and to share how to communicate and the best ways to communicate with one another. Personally, I found it incredibly relevant. I still haven't decided yet if I'm in the 40s category or the 50s, 60s category, having an elderly folks. I'm grateful that I have one down here, and children, and all good news. So thank you. As Mark said, or as Dr. Agronin said, we will be sending information in your follow-up email, how to connect with him, how to connect with the Mind Institute, and the article that he was referring to that was published in the Wall Street Journal. So thank you very much, Dr. Agronin. For those of us who are on, Tuesday, August 4th, we have a very special treat. We will be doing a celebration for Tu B'Av, the holiday of love, which is kind of like the Israeli Jewish Valentine's Day, with the presentation by Dr. Sandra Lilienthal and Erica Enton, who is the author of A Little Nudge. In addition, look for your email with additional meaningful ways to connect with our Federation and our Jewish community during these unprecedented times, including how you can make a real difference for those who need us by contributing to our annual campaign. Together with our caring community, we thrive. Stay safe, healthy, and be well. And once again, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.